Warm and joyful greetings to you today, and welcome to Nurture the Soul. I'm your host, Tracy Howe, Team Leader and Minister for Faith Education, Innovation, and Formation at the National Setting of the United Church of Christ, FaithINFO for short. Nurture the Soul is a weekly webinar sharing practical, educational, innovative, formational resources, engaging critical topics for our local churches and people of faith. It's produced by Justice and Local Church Ministries of the United Church of Christ. And we faithfully focus on care and education for people of God and create opportunities to gather, learn, engage, and digitally worship together. So from cultural and community organizing to congregational leadership, from worship and theology to resourcing small and rural churches, from ministry with youth and children to wide-ranging justice issues, we're featuring guest artists, authors, and key leaders. Nurture the Soul stays current to how the gospel and our faith is alive in this time. This is our space for connection, community, and nurture. Together, we can bring our church, our community, and the world towards the world God imagines for us all. So join us every Thursday at 3:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and look for special offerings outside of that as well. Today, we are starting a 3-part series on security and faith, engaging local church safety and security practices. Beloved, we live in a world of increasing vulnerability, charged public rhetoric, and more guns. Local congregations are encountering threats to persons and property, from their local churches where buildings are being vandalized and pastors are being threatened, to the greater community in which our local churches reside, where white Christian nationalists are demonstrating against drag shows and pride festivals. But what does security mean from a gospel perspective? What can we build together towards safety for all? If this conversation is important to you, I encourage you to consider supporting this ministry through texting UCC to 4144. Your prayerful and financial support helps programs like this continue and is essential to our work here at the National Setting of the United Church of Christ. Thank you, and thank you. Next week, we'll be continuing this series and looking at General Synod resolutions. Those are decisions that we make collectively as a denomination to step into more embodied discipleship. How do our General Synod resolutions inform these questions that we ask about community, safety, and security? We'll be joined by Katie Adams, our domestic policy advocate in the DC office, as well as Pastor Adam Erickson of Clackamas UCC. A local church pastor in the greater Portland area. And our third part, May 25th, will conclude by looking at the practices that local churches are implementing. We'll be joined by Reverend Jess Peacock of Chesterfield United Church of Christ, who that church found themselves having to build and implement systems after they were attacked with Molotov cocktails a couple of months ago. For hosting a drag show, as well as Richard Race from Parkway UCC, who's a lay leader in a church from the greater Kansas City area. And they have ongoing programs, including a school and a food pantry, and they've been looking at resources from FEMA practices to other things, trying to figure out what it means to create more security in this world. So we'll continue our conversation there. But today we're starting with community safety for all. We're living in times that call for prophetic imagination and courageous willingness to practice the world we wish to see, as Adrienne Maree Brown says in Emergent Strategy. These times call for honest reflection on how racism and violence are entangled with policing and property security. Can we imagine safety for all and start to build community practices for preparedness? These words are from the SURJ Faith website, and to help us engage, we have seasoned faith organizer, UCC minister, and dear friend of mine, the Reverend Anne Dunlap, who's going to bring us through SURJ's, which is short for Showing Up for Racial Justice, Community Safety for All Toolkit. So as local churches imagine safety, we look to the gospel to illuminate what security means and be bold and courageous in imagining safe communities for all, not just church properties. So welcome, Anne.
Thank you so much, Tracy. It's really good to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
It's really good to be with you. I have learned so much from you over the years, and I'm so grateful for the work you're doing organizationally with SURJ. I'm grateful for just the person you are in the world, really exuding this extravagant love and a clear vision of what it means to be kin with one another in the world. And what that means in terms of navigating justice building and so much injustice in the world. Before you get started, I'm going to share a little bit more for folks. So Anne is the faith organizing coordinator for Showing Up for Racial Justice and the founder of Fierce Rev Remedies, offering herbal consults, workshops, mentorship, as well as consulting, teaching, and preaching, all towards the goal of racial justice and collective liberation that's rooted in practice with the land. She is also the co-editor of and contributor to the forthcoming book, Building Up a New World, Congregational Organizing for Transformative Impacts, which is a project I'm also contributing author to, and we'll probably share a little bit more about that, but we just are thrilled that this resource that has been over 3 years in the making and including 20 different contributing authors is finally going to come to press. You actually can pre-order it already. We'll include links in the information details of this video and in the follow-up resources. So Anne, you're proud to be from Arkansas, but you live now in Western New York with your beloved and your kitty and your community and lots of growing things. Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Tracy. And just all the love right back to you, how much I've learned from you and the hope and nourishment I get from your music. Like that opening song for this webinar, I was just singing along with that. Help me to get grounded in this moment that we will be free. We will be free.
Amen.
And this work around building our own practices for community safety that don't rely on these systems that are so harmful and actually aren't interested in keeping us safe ultimately is a key piece of that, of how we all get free and get free together. So thank you for having me. Thank you for doing this series at all, because it's a really crucial conversation for congregations to be having right now.
Yeah.
And I really appreciate you naming the context in which we're living right now and what we at SURJ are really identifying as this rise in authoritarianism that is dangerous for all of us. There's a great resource that will come out to help us identify and think about like what actually is authoritarianism. What do we look for? How do we identify it? But I want to share just some of the core attributes to just get us thinking about this deeper, about this context. So rejecting democratic rules of the game is one of those attributes. I think we can think of lots of examples of that. Denying the legitimacy of our opponents. I think we can think of lots of examples of that. Sadly, there are lots of examples of all of these. Third is tolerating or encouraging political violence. And that violence can be from the state, but it can also be from other political actors. And curtailing the civil liberties of the opponents. So all of these targetings of drag shows, of trans people, of the bodies of folks with uteruses, with the anti-abortion stuff, like all of those are examples of this. And then finally, just breaking down social cohesion to divide and rule a society. So those are some of the attributes, and that we're seeing right now, like in increasing amounts. Like all of this is kind of part of the soup that the United States is, but we're in one of those moments where it's really increasing and becoming even more of a threat than usual. And one of the attributes that I really want to highlight for us and for this conversation is this one about tolerating and encouraging political violence, because this is really what we're seeing happening in our congregations. This rise, we're seeing this rise in targeted violence that's happening both by the state, so by police forces, militarized forces, Border Patrol, ICE, all of these things, but also.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
I want to ask you a question about all those groups that you just named. When you say authoritarianism, I'm thinking of like a single political actor. But what I'm hearing is that authoritarianism is, we can understand a lot of what's happening if we understand it more as a movement with collective pieces working together. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
And
that's helpful.
This explainer document that folks will talk about authoritarianism as a constellation of traits. It's not just one person being a jerk. It's a constellation of traits that are being seen throughout the political, economic, and social system. So it's not just Trump. Let's just be clear. It's not just Trump, but it's a whole constellation of things that are happening, whether or not he's around or not. And so that's a really great question, and I'm glad that you named that. So this rise in targeted violence,
Go ahead.
Yeah. That's happening both by the state. It's important to name that's also tolerated by the state. Like the state just stands by and permits this kind of violence, that supports this kind of authoritarianism in our communities. For example, the state's not going to control the guns. They're not going to hold white people or police accountable for violence. State's not going to protect those who are targeted for violence by those doing the targeting. For example, saying that threats are just free speech and so that they can be ignored. We can think about the recent, it happened, I forget exactly where in Ohio, but in Ohio, I saw footage of this when Nazis showed up to march outside of a drag show, and the cops just sort of stood by as if that wasn't an actual threat.
Meaning they were like, oh, this is just a free speach demonstration.
Yeah, it's just a free speech demonstration.
Okay. So I know a lot about this because being an organizer in Charlottesville, all of the Unite the Right organizers came under the premise of free speech. And organizers and folks who had been working together in the years leading up to that knew full well that the intent was to bring violence, racial violence at that, to the community. And we tried to get the city to shut it down, but they were like, we can't, otherwise they'll sue us. So literally, we're being, we saw all that influx of violence. None of us who had been organizing and working ahead of time were surprised by anything that happened that day.
Yeah.
We knew all the militias that were coming, that they'd be armed. We knew all the neo-Nazi groups, white supremacists, nationalists that were coming, because we had just really dedicated and incredible organizers in that city. And it wasn't until 3 years later that they were found guilty of conspiring to bring racial violence. So they were found guilty in a federal court, that they weren't, orchestrate. They weren't just like exercising free speech. They actually were conspiring to bring racial violence, and they were found guilty based on historic laws that white white supremacy. Racial terrorism is violence. And you can, now as queer and trans people are targeted, we see the same kind of like dehumanization, othering, this very targeted violence.
Yeah.
So I see how this is happening in the community, but how does this really bring us to local churches though? And like, what does that mean for like, their Sunday worship services or the food pantries that they're having, or if they're involved, in programs in the community? Like, if we understand our context as authoritarianism and increasing authoritarianism that's enabling more extremism and violence, what does that mean for our local churches?
Yeah, I think the first thing I want to say about that is that it's always been true that Black churches and synagogues and mosques have always been targets of violence, right? That's always been true, regardless of where we're kind of at in this flexing of authoritarian muscle in our political system. And it's not unusual for queer affirming white churches, predominantly white churches, or churches that support Black Lives Matter with a banner or what have you, to get like hate mail, to maybe have their banner vandalized. But what we're also seeing right now is a rise in the targeting of churches that might have previously thought that that was not something that was going to happen to them. So I'm in conversation right now with two churches that have been targeted by white supremacist violence, because I think hate speech is violence. If I come up and say hateful things to you and pretend to swing at your face, but don't actually hit you, is that not violence? Like, is that not violence? And so, that kind of like, I wish you were dead. I hope that you die. I hope that your church burns down. I hope that, you're a sinner and you're going to hell. And I hope that just all kinds of just terrible things, but also buildings being filmed, children being filmed, that footage going out on the internet, the church that you just described, with the Molotov cocktails. The congregations that I've been in conversation with this kind of targeting have all said to me, we tried to talk to the police for help, and they're just like, it's free speech, unless they actually do something, there's not really anything that we can do.
Right.
And what that does is create the conditions for more violence to actually happen, right? It's exactly what you're describing happened in Charlottesville, where it's like you create the conditions for increased escalated violence to happen. You do that with your speech, and they know what they're doing. They're clearly like tiptoeing right up to the line of what would be enforceable by law. We can have a long conversation about the usefulness of that, but they're doing that intentionally, walking right up to that line because they know it protects them. And so if a congregation is open and affirming, like in the UCC context, promoting racial justice, if a congregation is supporting immigrants or refugees, for example, maybe a sanctuary congregation, or you have some kind of ministry that is serving targeted communities right now by white supremacist violence, then you really need to be thinking about how your congregation is going to practice its own kind of community safety. Because we need to understand that it's actually not the role of the police to be helpful in responding to violence against those targeted for oppression. That's not their job in this system. It's actually their job to enforce the structure of oppression, which we can do a webinar about that on another day, because I could talk for a long time about that. But just to name that outright, it's not in their self-interest. It's not in the structure's interest to be helpful, to help prevent that violence, to help to keep us safe, because That's what they exist for, is to assure that that violence continues. So turning to the cops, is unhelpful because they decline to be helpful. And that can leave a congregation feeling like, well, is there nothing that we can do? Are we all alone in this? Do we just have to wait until something happens?
Yeah.
But the other flip side of that, and then I want to hear what your question is that if you do work with the police, like one of the impacts of that is that it actually increases control and surveillance of everyone perceived not to belong, in quotes, in the church's neighborhood, even people who use or come to the church's building. So houseless folks, again, immigrants, refugees, queer and trans folks, mentally ill folks, if you're serving any of those folks, if they're part of your community, by utilizing police, you're actually increasing the possibility that violence is going to be perpetrated on them. So it's kind of a perceived protection, but through increased violence.
That's a tricky one. Maybe we can talk a little bit about that, because I know a number of local churches who have experienced disruption or threats and contacted the police, who, yes, couldn't do anything about those things that happened, but then they had a police presence then, during their Sunday worship, for example. But what I'm hearing is, and what's clear to me is that vulnerable people for whom the church ostensibly exists and centers, then all of a sudden, understandably, don't have access to those spaces. I mean, if I'm a migrant or, a Black person walking into a predominantly white sanctuary and there's a police, that automatically makes me an other. Like, do I belong here? And might subject me to surveillance and questioning and those kinds of things. And I have, like, very literally also heard from local churches that police wanted to, like, set up cameras or have access to cameras on grounds and those kinds of things. But what about, like, what do you say to a local church that's like, well, we have police officers in our local church, like members?
Yeah. What do you do about that? You've got to have a conversation with them. Really hard conversation with them. And you can't do it by yourself. Like, you actually, like, first of all, need to build a team and do some organizing around this, and, like, talk to the folks, whether they're police officers themselves, or maybe they're a prison guard or some other involvement in the police and prison industrial complex. Maybe they got a family member, or maybe they're just generally supportive and don't get why we might do this, but you have to be able to talk to them. And what I think, needs to happen is you have to be ready to support them if they decide to defect. Because the system of policing does not allow, actually, for the good cop. As much as the individuals that we may know and love and are trying to do things in a good way, the system itself will silence them, will punish them, will fire them, if they try to stand up, speak out against the kind of violence that police departments perpetrate. That we had a situation like that here in Buffalo, where a police officer spoke out in the middle of somebody, being ferociously beaten, and she lost her job for speaking out. The police unions function to protect the violence that law enforcement relies on. So for me, it's about, what is the gospel? What is the good news? And it's that part of what it is that you can at any moment change your life and opt for the way of living in the world that actually contributes to collective thriving.
Yeah.
What we don't have is good ways for people who want to do that in big ways. Like, I'm going to quit my job. Like, okay, are you going to actually help me support my family and make sure that we have health insurance, make sure that we've got food on their table if I quit my job or I get fired for speaking out?
Yeah.
Like, if we surround those folks with as much love as possible, not just like nice feelings, I mean like material goods, right? That's what we suggest that congregations do, like have those deep conversations, be prepared for pushback, and be a place that if that person, does decide to be a disruptor in the system, that they will have their back.
Amen.
Yeah.
So if we as local churches, communities grounded in a gospel love, are committed to vulnerable people and building community in a radical way that extends across different kinds of embodiments and orientations and genealogies. And therefore, it's been projected on me my entire life. Oh, if I just, don't feel safe or whatever, I just call the police. If what I'm unlearning is that if I'm unlearning that message, and now I'm centering the community that not only might exist, but maybe the community that I want to exist in my local church, then what do we do? How do we start? What does safety and security look like? Because it's not just like we hope for something, right? Or is there anything like practical that we can do?
Oh yeah, there's so much that we can do, I said earlier that the authoritarianism and kind of like our, socioeconomic system in general wants us to feel like there's nothing else that we can do, wants us to feel afraid and alone and helpless. That's by design. But there are things that we can do. And so at SURJ, we developed within the faith program our Community Safety for All campaign to work with congregations and train congregations in how to build our own practices for safety and security that are grounded in that gospel love, that are grounded in that vision of collective thriving that is central to God's vision for creation. That is what the divine wants for us, for all of us to have access, and not just like access by filling out a gazillion forms, but like the recognition of abundance of food, of shelter, access to healthcare, mental health care, the things that we need as humans with bodies, and ways of holding one another accountable for harm, because that does happen. We do harm one another. So one useful definition or use of the theology of original sin is like, yeah, we are going to hurt each other. That is a thing that happens. We are not perfect. But there are ways of holding one another accountable for harm that don't rely on like further harm happening, and that are grounded in like, you are still a human for the person who's perpetrated the harm, and we're not going to throw you away. Right. So one of the things that we developed for this campaign, that we worked with congregations for a few years in kind of a cohort model. And then in 2020, in the uprisings in 2020, we released this toolkit that congregations can use to like, figure out your own context and build the kinds of practices that make sense for your community. And so the toolkit offers safety planning resources, like sample safety plans and checklists. Where can we go to for training? So a list of organizations, a wide variety of scenarios, the things people can try for a wide variety of scenarios. There's training videos there. There's also just basic political education resources there, like why does policing exist? What's the history? What are the roots of that? What does it mean when we say, or at least I say, that policing, exists to uphold white supremacy? Well, what does that mean? So there's, a lot of, what is abolition? Why do we use this language? What does that mean? So there's resources there. There are also theological resources for helping us both have the for example, in Christian tradition, like the biblical stories that uphold that vision of collective thriving, of collective safety that doesn't rely on more harm, but that can also help us interrogate some of the ways in which our tradition is actually providing the moral and theological undergirding for systems of harm, for policing, for white supremacy, for the structures that we live in right now. So it's very, very robust. I'm really, really proud of it.
Can you take us through some highlights of the toolkit? Like, what are some highlights so that people can expect to find?
Yeah, so some of the highlights, they're particularly around this building the practices, right? Because he's specifically asked about the practices. So one of the highlights are that we developed a couple of sets of assessments to help a congregation think through, what kind of people come to our building? Who are they? Whether come to your building means they come for Sunday worship, or they're coming to a ministry, or they rent space from us, or they shelter out of the rain, when it's raining outside, all of those kinds of considerations. What are some scenarios in which our congregation would usually call 911? Like, when does that actually happen? Do we actually do that for everything? Maybe we don't. And then paired with the assessments are these action scenarios, as many as we could think of. So if you call 911 for this, try this instead. If you're facing this situation, try this instead. And these aren't just things that we have made up, but they are things that communities have been practicing actually for generations, because Black communities, Indigenous communities, immigrant communities, poor and working class white communities, houseless folks, like they actually know how to navigate the world without calling the police to resolve things, because they know if the police come, somebody could die, somebody could get hauled off to jail unfairly, all of those things. So these are things that communities have actually been trying. There's resources in there from Jewish communities that have built security teams to protect their synagogues during the high holy days, so that they aren't just, well, we think this might work in some kind of imaginary world, but actual things that people have developed, safety plans from actual congregations, Jewish congregations, UU congregations, Christian congregations. And then like so many resources, again, like where to find trainings, links to recordings and resources of trainings that we've done.
When you say trainings, like what kind of trainings might I be interested in if I am trying to develop a safety and security plan?
So some of the trainings that we think are really important once you have built your team, because I want to emphasize that again, you got to build a team. You can't do this by yourself. Build a team, organize your people. You also want to like do some assessment of your congregation. What do you actually need? What's most likely for your context, and start there. But also like, what assets do you have? Do you already have folks? Do you have some EMTs in your congregation? Do you have folks who know how to de-escalate people in crisis? Like you may already have some folks in your congregation that you can bring into your team, that you can help to provide trainings. So do some of that also. And the kinds of trainings that we recommend that folks have include de-escalation, like how to just calm people down. And if you can't calm them down, like what do you actually do to redirect them away from where everyone else is?
Mm-hmm.
We recommend that people get some training around actual like how to understand the security of your building and the perimeter around your building. We've got a recording for that actually linked in the toolkit from a training that we did last summer. You know, what kinds of entrances and exits? Do you have locks on your windows? What kinds of cameras are useful, but that don't feed right to, you know, to the police? How do you have like some awareness in your team of people going in and out? Do you keep your door locked when there are people in the building? Like all those kinds of things.
So what you're talking about, I'm imagining like people are going to need to get things in their bodies when we talk about practice.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Even if it's as simple as this is the best exit in the event of an emergency, you know, running those fire drills. That's why we take the time to do it, so that
Great example.
when we're in crisis, our body has memory. And this has also been really critical in a lot of the trainings I've done, and I know you've done, is that we can't just, you know, in a worst case scenario where there's, you know, a live shooting, for example, we can't just say, here's what you do if there's a live shooting, and then you hear that information. It actually, we need to get it in our bodies and practice communicating clearly. And but the idea of running drills like in a community setting might be startling. So I'm just curious if you've had any feedback from communities who have, or even seen communities who've started to like run scenarios and trained, and if that's been a positive thing, or what, you know, what that's been like for them. I think, you know, I think spiritual formation is a very embodied thing. It should change our pathways. And that when we do ritual in service, we're actually seeking to have a transformation that happens in our entire being, not just like, oh, it's
not just a head thing.
Intellectually understand this theology and why I'm doing it, that it changes the way we perceive things. And the benefits of training, though it might be startling up front, to me have been you can access and maintain, like your body knows and doesn't go into just a reactionary mode, to be able to not only respond effectively, but perhaps to help others.
And when I have done security training, it's also when you run some scenarios, you do some practice, it's also about, oh, how does my body actually respond? What happens in my emotional center? What happens in my body? And so you're actually also then kind of practicing, okay, if this is what's happening, am I fight or flight? Am I freezing? Like, what's my go-to? Then you can work with that some and practice with that some of like how we also tend to what's happening in our own bodies, even just practice, because our brains don't really have a way to like distinguish between this is just a practice scenario, somebody yelling in my face, and this is an actual dangerous scenario of somebody yelling. Our brain is just going, somebody's yelling in my face, you know. And so I think it does take a lot of, you know, care to hold folks through that process, and to really love and nurture on folks. So when you're doing these trainings, like mental health and first aid rapid response is really great to have. Like, so you do that, but how are you also tending to the folks who are engaging in this? So doing some debriefing that's not just about what did we do right, what did we do wrong, but also what's happening in here, what's happening in your body and your heart, you know, and how do we hold that? How do we tend to that? Have some ritual around that. Do we also, maybe part of our plan needs to be, we've got some therapists, some counselors who are willing to do some free sessions if we need a little support, a little help, if something actually does go down. And in congregations where they actually have done this kind of training and practiced, and then actually, I'm thinking of the synagogues I know that actually ran their own security during High Holy Days. I think the experience is actually really overwhelmingly positive. Even like, given that,
Yeah.
right, if like, it's also like, why in the world do we even need to do this? Like, what kind of a world do we live in that this is actually how we need to live?
Right.
And that kind of hypervigilance, but that it's actually positive that congregations come to feel like we can actually take care of ourselves. There is something that we can do. We don't just have to be helpless in the face of white supremacist violence or state violence or what have you. Like, we can actually take care of each other. And that's a good thing.
Yeah,
Even if
it
we're
is.
not happy that we have to be able to do it, but that is actually a good thing. And then, like, the brilliant thing about it is, if you get some folks trained up, like, you could offer that to another congregation that might not be in that place yet, but needs some support.
Mm,
Like, a Christian church could offer their trained folks to a synagogue during High Holy Days, and then, like, vice versa. So we also just really encourage congregations to partner not only with other faith communities, but also organizations and groups in their communities that might already have this kind of team developed that they could partner with while they're getting themselves built up.
right.
Because not only is that like an easy way to get some of that safety practice to your community, but it's strengthening the community too. It's strengthening that like collective network and getting into collective formation, which is one of the key ways that we actually fight back against authoritarianism, against this kind of violence from the white supremacist movement, right? Is like that collective power. So, definitely do it for yourself, but then also get connected in, because that is going to strengthen our movement. It's going to strengthen our collective safety. It's going to begin to defang some of the ways that this violence gets targeted at
Right.
us, when we're this collective front that says, no, actually, you are not going to do this.
Right.
And it's really crucial that our churches are part of that, especially in a US context where white Christian theology and stories and symbols and institutions are being wielded towards authoritarianism, are being wielded towards white supremacist nationalist goals. You got a bunch of churches that are like, oh, no, you don't. We're going to take care of our people and all of the people around us.
Right.
That's powerful.
It is powerful. And, in the United Church of Christ, we're very proud of our abolitionist legacy. And we lift up folks that fought against slavery. We lift up folks that were part of the Underground Railroad. And now realizing like we're in a position where some queer and trans folks are trying to leave the state that they live in because policy has gotten so crazy. We have a beautiful history in the sanctuary movement of some churches doing this, but now it's just kind of expanding and expanding. And what I hear from you is that once we take stock of who we are as a community and realize the resources and really the power we have to create, I would call it sanctuary in a greater kind of sense, safety and security in the context with which we live, which is always going to be limited, but sanctuary that is safety within community, that we actually can partner and be part of really important things right now in the world. Once we, make sure that we're secure. So I'm going to recap some of what I've heard from you. moving from really helping local churches understand increasing threat, increasing vulnerability for everyone, directly linked to an increase in authoritarianism in our political, social context. And what that then illuminates is what it, or I guess, helps us frame questions in a better way. What does it mean if we're living in this time of increasing authoritarianism that includes these systems of security in the world? What does it mean to create safety and security within a gospel framework where we're centering and have a preferential option in the embodiment of Jesus, preferential option given towards those most vulnerable? What does that mean? And the good news is we actually have examples that have been alive in the world already. This didn't come out of a vacuum, but that you've created this wonderful toolkit, cultivating wisdom and actually basing it in gospel practices or practices of faith towards building, a collective liberation, collective safety. The title is Community Safety for All. And that it starts with very practical things that, first of all, let's do some assessments. Let's figure out, what your church is dealing with, who are the folks that are there, what are the most likely scenarios that your community is likely to face. And then also assessing what are the gifts that we have here in this beautiful community of faith. Maybe John, who is a beautiful choir member, also actually has experienced de-escalating, or actually turns out once we start training, maybe we didn't have a lot of background, but actually has a great grounding and capacity for that, because we certainly realize I have in organizing, I don't have capacity for everything. So it's about learning where do I fit into the whole, and being able to facilitate that. Maybe people who have limited mobility, aren't going to be the best ones to confront a disruptor who comes, or
you never know.
But you never know. You never know. But maybe they are great at facilitating that safety plan, making sure everyone's cared for, and are excellent communicators and can stay grounded in a certain kind of way. And so we take stock of the gifts in our community. We find the training that's necessary to make sure that we have it all together. And then we start to build our own safety plan. And we don't have to do that in a vacuum either, because there's examples and we can think through things. And it would be good to physically do this, to put the team together, to actually communicate well with our congregation, and see, this is the space we share together, and this is how we can kind of create some knowledge about who we're with at all times, and if we need to move, or something is happening that causes us to seek shelter elsewhere, we know how to do that. And when we maybe get a grasp of that and are good at practicing it with ourselves, that this is now a gift that we have to bear witness in the world to a God of love and liberation. And also, then we don't have to worry about anything bad ever happening to us, right, Anne? That's the goal. That nothing bad ever happens to us. If we
I would love that.
If we have a safety and security plan, nothing bad will ever happen to us. Is that right?
When Jesus comes, then maybe comes back, then maybe, but it doesn't guarantee that nothing bad is ever going to happen. It what it does is empowers us in the care of our own people, the care of our people. It gives us skills. It makes more choices possible. it doesn't guarantee that nothing bad will ever happen. Just like in a relationship, of very loving people, you're still gonna get in a fight, you're still gonna hurt each other. That's just part of what it means. And also, again, and until Jesus comes again, if we want to use that framework, like, we still live in these systems that are harmful, and that is also the biblical witness. Pharaoh gets drowned in the Red Sea. But then what happens? Then we have to deal with Assyria, and then we have to deal with Babylon, and then we have to deal with, and Jesus and his people are dealing with Rome. So we can learn from our ancestors and be held in that lineage, that stream, that cloud of witnesses that are like, this is what we do to protect one another, to nourish one another, to love on one another, because this system doesn't love us. It doesn't love any of us. It does not give one single darn about us. But this is how we love one another. This is how we live out that biblical call that Jesus reiterates in his lifetime, to love your neighbor. And they're all our neighbor.
Amen. A lot of creating a safety plan and creating, kind of assessing tools, like, it's all organizing, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I want to shift a little bit, and thank you so much for your introduction to the Community Safety for All Toolkit, an invaluable resource for all people desiring to community safety for all. But
it's written for white people, to be clear, but anybody can use it. Like, anybody can use it. And I want to add one more thing to that, which is that there is also support. Like, you can reach out to us. You don't just get it and then you're like, you can't ever ask us questions. Like, there's, reach out to us, support. We also have quarterly practice circles where congregations who are trying to work on these things can come together to problem solve, build community, do some skill shares, ask some of the same questions that you've just asked tonight or this afternoon, or I don't know what time it is. And so, because that's important too, right?
Right. So I wanna share this other great resource with folks that we actually, in this book, Building Up a New World, Congregational Organizing for Transformative Impact, edited by the Reverend Ann Dunlap and the Reverend Vahisha Hassan. You and Vahisha structured that in a way to kind of ground folks in, what is important about what is organizing, what are the frameworks we need to understand, what are the voices and the people and the communities we need to center, and then also really practical tools. And we actually have a chapter in that book on community defense and community security as well. And so I'm really excited to share that. But what are you excited about when this book coming out?
I'm just excited it's going to be out, for one thing. Like, whenever I talk to somebody, they're like, when is it coming out? Like, and now I can say, you can pre-order it now and have it by midsummer, which is almost here. Midsummer will be here tomorrow, because we're launching it at Synod. But I'm really excited about just getting it in folks' hands and then starting to work with people on the tools that are in there. There's just so much rich content, actually, the practical pieces, the things that we need to center, all of those. If we're building a new world, this is kind of how we thought about it. Like, what are the tools that we actually need? What are the tools that congregations need to remind ourselves that we actually know how to organize, and then put those skills towards collective liberation, towards the flourishing of all creation. And so, having that chapter on the policing stuff that Nicola and Logan wrote. Having the chapter on the Charlottesville experience from Smash, like I think that also ties into this this conversation too, the like practical suggestions about how you get prepared for when white supremacists show up in your community. Like, we might not have thought that was a thing 5 years ago, but oh my goodness, it is.
It's
like it is.
All too common scenario now. Yeah.
Your chapter on cultural organizing and all those beautiful examples that you have there.
I think what was
so great.
Yeah, I think what was so exciting to me is that all of, it's not that it's like we knew, and we continually, and you and Vahisha very masterfully were constantly going to the contributing authors and saying, how is this already being done in the local churches, and lift that up. And indeed, because church is cultural organizing space at its core, community building space, local churches are already doing this in so many ways. Now, understanding a different framework and understanding how to implement this practice in this setting, all of a sudden we become a transformative presence in our community. And while it's helpful to know different specific organizing strategies, theories of change, like I'm a part of this interfaith, model that does 2-year cycles towards implementing programmatic change. This is really seeking to just help our local churches understand that discipleship includes this. Like when we embody our faith, we are seeking to be transformative. And since our context is requiring so much confrontation with injustice and just atrocities that come in dehumanization, it's just part of what we do. And it's the mystery and the miracle of it all is that we actually can find community and joy and all the fruits of the living spirit in that.
Yes.
So I'm really, really excited about it.
Yeah, me too.
So, Building Up a New World, Congregational Organizing for Transformative Impact, available for pre-order now with Pilgrim Press. Reverend Ann Dunlap, I am so grateful to have shared this time with you. Thank you so much.
Likewise, thank you so much. I just love you so much, Tracy.
I love you too. And
so grateful for you.
I love what you said about this work empowers us to care for our people. And that's such a wonderful place to hold. Safety and security evokes certain images for me in my mind. But if I talk about empowering the community to care for itself and the wider community it's based in, that's just a really beautiful thing. So I'm going to close us out with a blessing. To all you who have joined us, I bless you to be empowered to care for your people, that you would be open to the spirit of community, of love, the living spirit of God in asking these questions of how do we care for the community we are a part of. And I thank you so much for joining us today for Nurture the Soul.
Thank you.
Siblings in Christ, if you are moved by this conversation, if what's been offered here has helped enhance your ministry or has nurtured your soul for the journey, please consider donating to the annual fund of the United Church of Christ by texting UCC to 41444. Your support will help to provide programs like this, which are an essential part of our ministries in the United Church of Christ. Thank you for your support. Be blessed on your journey and know that you are not alone. We are holding you in prayer. Amen.